The village of Oakmire rested like a forgotten dream between rolling hills and ancient forests in Illinois territory. In 1844, as the state was still shedding its frontier skin, this settlement of barely 300 souls became the unwilling host to a mystery that would haunt the American medical records for decades. 73 women entered the newly established Oakmire Maternal Institute over its first year of operation. Only 32 were documented to have departed with healthy children. The others vanished into footnotes of history, their fates sealed in records that remained locked in university archives until 1923. The peculiar case of the Oakmire triplets would have remained buried in time's indifferent soil had it not been for a collection of personal journals, medical notes, and correspondence discovered in a sealed trunk in the basement of Chicago's Northwestern Medical College. These documents, untouched for nearly 8 decades, painted a picture so disturbing that several university officials advocated for their immediate destruction. Instead, they were sealed again, this time in the university's restricted archives, where they remained until just last year. Are you brave enough to face what those pages revealed, to confront a truth that challenged not just the moral boundaries of medical science, but the very understanding of human development itself? The horror that unfolded in that small Illinois village wasn't born of superstition or the occult practices that often colored frontier tales. It emerged from something far more rational and infinitely more dangerous, the unbridled ambition of men who believed science answered to no moral authority, but their own curiosity. The winter of 1844 wrapped Oakmire in an oppressive silence. Snow fell in thick, unrelenting sheets, transforming the surrounding oak forests into ghostly sentinels. The wind carried whispers through the village, wordless sounds that seemed to emanate from the imposing 3-story building perched on the northern hill. The Oakmire Maternal Institute stood in stark contrast to the humble wooden structures of the village below. Its brick facade and gleaming windows spoke of progress, of scientific advancement pushing against the superstitions of the frontier. At night, kerosene lamps burned until dawn, their yellow glow a constant presence through even the fiercest blizzards. Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood had arrived from Philadelphia 18 months earlier, accompanied by his young wife, Eleanor, and an assistant, Dr. Edwin Pierce. Their credentials were impeccable, Harvard and Edinburgh-educated physicians who spoke eloquently of bringing modern obstetrical care to the rural women of Illinois. The town council, comprised primarily of ambitious merchants eager to elevate Oakmire's standing in the region, embraced the physicians' proposal with enthusiasm and financial support. Within 6 months, the institute stood completed, its doors open to expecting mothers from across 3 counties. The Institute's promise was compelling: scientific birthing methods, pain management innovations, and specialized care for difficult pregnancies, all supervised by physicians trained in the most advanced techniques from Europe. For the frontier women of Illinois, accustomed to relying on midwives and prayer during childbirth, such promises were nearly irresistible, particularly to those carrying multiple children who faced terrifying mortality rates under normal circumstances. We seek to understand the miracle of multiple births, Dr. Blackwood wrote in his circular distributed throughout neighboring communities. Science now allows us to ensure these special mothers and their precious children survive what has too often been a death sentence. The Oakmire Institute welcomes these cases with particular interest. What the circular didn't mention was Dr. Blackwood's obsession with the phenomenon of identical multiples, a condition he had been studying with increasing fervor since his days as a medical student. Thomas Miller, a local carpenter who helped construct the Institute's interior chambers, was the first to notice something unusual. Working late one November evening to finish the delivery room's specialized cabinetry, he heard sounds from behind a door, marked simply, "Records." Thinking a window might have blown open in the storm, he approached the heavy oak door. It wasn't crying exactly, he later told his wife in a conversation she recorded in her household journal. More like the sound a wounded animal makes, something caught between life and death. But human, Mary, unmistakably human. Miller placed his ear against the door and heard the rustling of papers, the clink of glass, and beneath it all, that persistent, muffled sound. When he reported it to Dr. Pierce the next morning, the physician smiled thinly. "Your concern is appreciated, Mr. Miller, but unnecessary. What you heard was simply Dr. Blackwood playing a recording of infant distress. We use such sounds to train our nurses in recognizing different types of neonatal distress." The explanation satisfied the townspeople, but left Miller uneasy. Phonograph recordings weren't introduced until decades later. His wife noted in the margin of her journal entry, a comment added sometime in the 1870s. Miller might have pursued his concerns further had his attention not been diverted by the arrival of the Sullivan Sisters in early December. Mary and Martha Sullivan, identical twins themselves, had married brothers from a neighboring farm. By some biological curiosity, both women had conceived within weeks of each other, and both showed signs of carrying multiple children. Their simultaneous arrival at the Institute caused a flurry of excitement. Dr. Blackwood personally greeted them at the entrance, his usually severe face animated with an enthusiasm that bordered on inappropriate, given the women's discomfort. "You represent a unique opportunity for medical science," he told them, as they were settled into adjacent rooms on the Institute's second floor. "Identical twins carrying multiple children. It's unprecedented in the literature. Your stay with us will be extended, I'm afraid. We must observe every stage of your unique condition. What began as a stay of weeks stretched into months." The husbands, initially allowed daily visits, found themselves gradually restricted to weekly appearances, then fortnightly. Letters from the sisters became increasingly rare, their handwriting, once nearly identical, growing distinctly different. Martha's retained its fluid, graceful curves, while Mary's became jagged, hurried, and finally almost childlike in its simplicity. Martha has developed complications requiring specialized rest and isolation, Dr. Pierce explained to James Sullivan when he demanded to see his wife in February, and Mary finds the emotional strain of visitors too taxing in her condition. "Surely you understand our priority must be the health of both mothers and their unborn children." The explanation, delivered with professional courtesy but unmistakable finality, was reinforced by the presence of the town sheriff, who had developed a peculiar loyalty to the Institute after Dr. Blackwood successfully treated his daughter's scarlet fever. Sarah Cooper, a young nurse recruited from a Chicago hospital, noticed the changes in the Sullivan Sisters before anyone else. Assigned to their care, she observed how Martha remained alert and engaged, while Mary grew increasingly docile and vacant. Most disturbing were the mornings when she found Mary staring at her own reflection in the small hand mirror, touching her face as if unsure the features belonged to her. "I don't recognize myself sometimes," Mary confided to Sarah during a bath. "I look in the mirror and see Martha's face instead of mine." When Sarah suggested gently that as identical twins, this confusion was understandable, Mary's response chilled her. "No, you don't understand. I feel like I'm becoming Martha. Like parts of her are replacing parts of me. Last night I remembered her childhood memories, not my own." Sarah began keeping her own record, a small notebook hidden in her quarters, documenting the changes in both women. She noted Martha's increasing agitation during examinations, contrasted with Mary's unnatural calm. She recorded the strange marks that appeared on Mary's arms, tiny puncture wounds that Dr. Pierce dismissed as necessary blood sampling for her condition. Most disturbing were the nights when Dr. Blackwood would summon both sisters to the third floor, where the special cases were housed. Sarah was never permitted to accompany them, but she observed their returns. Martha would come back trembling, often in tears, while Mary returned placid, her eyes dilated, moving with the mechanical precision of a sleepwalker. "I believe they're experimenting on them somehow," Sarah wrote in her hidden journal. "Today I observed Dr. Blackwood comparing measurements of their abdomens, not with the concern of a physician monitoring pregnancy, but with the cold calculation of a scientist tracking the progress of an experiment. He speaks of the subjects, rather than by their names when dictating notes to Dr. Pierce. In early March, as the winter's grip began to loosen, Sarah made her most disturbing discovery. Assigned to organize the filing cabinet in Dr. Blackwood's office while he attended a medical conference in Springfield, she found a locked drawer. The key, fortuitously forgotten in his haste to depart, fit perfectly. Inside lay a journal bound in dark leather, its pages filled with Blackwood's precise handwriting. The journal detailed a theory so bizarre, Sarah initially believed it to be fiction. Dr. Blackwood hypothesized that identical twins shared not just genetic material, but a deeper connection, what he called a biological resonance. This resonance, he believed, could be manipulated, allowing traits, memories, and even physiological characteristics to be transferred from one twin to another through a combination of chemical compounds and electrical stimulation. The Sullivan case provides the perfect natural experiment, he wrote. Identical twins carrying multiple fetuses. If my theory is correct, we can selectively influence which developmental patterns express themselves in each sister's womb. The possibilities are extraordinary. The ability to engineer the development of one set of multiples by manipulating the other. Sarah read with growing horror as the journal detailed the treatments administered to the sisters. Martha subjected to electrical stimulation while in proximity to Mary, who received injections of compounds derived from Martha's blood. The goal, it seemed, was to create a developmental synchronicity between the separate sets of unborn children, to make Mary's triplets develop as perfect mirrors of Martha's, despite their different paternal genetics. March 1st. Subject MS 1, showing strong response to stimulation protocols. Subject MS 2 demonstrates corresponding changes in fetal positioning and heart rates following treatment. Breakthrough imminent. Sarah realized with clarity what she was witnessing. Dr. Blackwood wasn't simply studying the sisters, he was attempting to create something unprecedented. The triplets in Mary's womb were being deliberately influenced to develop as identical to Martha's unborn children, despite being cousins rather than siblings. It was an experiment in manipulating nature's most fundamental boundaries. That night, Sarah made her decision. She would help the sisters escape. She approached Martha first, showing her the journal entries and explaining her suspicions. Martha's horror quickly crystallized into resolve. Mary isn't herself anymore, she whispered. Yesterday she called me by my childhood nickname, one only my parents ever used. She recited a poem our father taught me in private when I was 8. She couldn't possibly know these things. Martha's hands protectively cradled her swollen abdomen. What is he doing to our babies? The escape was planned for 3 nights later, when Dr. Blackwood would again be away. Sarah arranged for a wagon to be waiting at the edge of the property, driven by her cousin, who asked no questions in exchange for a month's wages. She prepared sleeping drafts for the night nurse and copied the most damning pages from Blackwood's journal. The night arrived with an unexpected complication. Mary refused to leave. Not with outright rejection, but with a vacant incomprehension that was somehow more disturbing. "Why would I leave?" she asked, her voice flat and emotionless. "Doctor, Blackwood is helping us. He's making us better, making us whole." Her hand moved in unconscious mimicry of Martha's habitual gesture, tucking hair behind her ear, exactly as her sister did. "Besides, I'm not well enough to travel. Neither is Martha." When Martha tried to reason with her, Mary's expression changed subtly. "You're confused, Martha. I'm the healthy one." Dr. Blackwood explained everything. The conversation grew increasingly disorienting as Mary began referring to herself and Martha interchangeably, as if the boundaries between their identities had dissolved. Sarah made the heartbreaking decision that night. They couldn't force Mary to leave. Her condition made her unpredictable, and her loyalty to Dr. Blackwood might prompt her to alert him. Martha, tears streaming down her face, finally agreed they must leave without her sister. "We'll get help," Martha promised as she cast one last glance at Mary's room. We'll return for you and the babies." The escape itself was remarkably simple. The night nurse drank her tea, laced with the sleeping draught, and was soon snoring at her station. Sarah and Martha slipped out through the kitchen entrance and hurried across the moonlit grounds to where the wagon waited. As they pulled away, Martha looked back at the Institute's silhouette against the night sky, its third-floor windows illuminated, despite the late hour. "She's still in there," she whispered. "Part of me is still in there." They traveled through the night, reaching Springfield by dawn. Sarah's cousin departed with his payment and a warning never to mention his involvement. The two women sought refuge with a Quaker family, known for their discretion and opposition to medical experimentation, common allies for those escaping questionable asylum treatments in that era. Martha's written testimony, combined with the copied pages from Blackwood's journal, were presented to a sympathetic physician at the Illinois Medical Society. Dr. Harold Winters, known for his conservative views on experimental medicine, was initially skeptical. The claims seemed fantastical, more aligned with the sensational stories in penny dreadfuls than serious medical misconduct. Yet the journal entries, written in Blackwood's distinctive academic style and referencing verifiable medical concepts, gave him pause. "If even half of what you describe is accurate," he told them after a long silence, "it represents the most unconscionable breach of medical ethics I've encountered in 30 years of practice, Doctor." Winters agreed to accompany them back to Oakmire, along with 2 colleagues and the county sheriff. The small party arrived 4 days after Martha's escape, only to find the Institute in a state of chaotic activity. Wagons were being loaded with crates and trunks. Staff hurried between the building and the vehicles with the urgent efficiency of those executing a long-planned evacuation. When confronted at the entrance, Dr. Pierce claimed complete ignorance of any Martha Sullivan as a patient. "We have a Mary Sullivan in our care, gentlemen, but she's never mentioned having a sister. Her delusions have been a challenging aspect of her treatment. She frequently creates elaborate fantasies, including an imaginary twin." The county sheriff, confused by the conflicting accounts, requested to see Mary Sullivan immediately. The group was led to a sunlit room on the second floor, where a heavily pregnant woman sat by the window, her hands folded protectively over her swollen abdomen. "Martha!" Sarah gasped, then fell silent at Dr. Winters's cautioning gesture. The woman turned, her face, identical to Martha's, registering polite confusion. "I'm Mary Sullivan," she said with a vacant smile. "I don't believe we've met." Her eyes passed over Martha without a flicker of recognition. Martha stepped forward, trembling. "Mary, it's me, your sister." The woman's expression remained pleasant but distant. "I'm afraid you're confused. I have no sister, Doctor. Blackwood has explained that my condition sometimes causes visitors to mistake me for someone else." She delivered the words with rehearsed precision. Dr. Winters observed the interaction with increasing concern. When he asked to examine the patient, Dr. Pierce protested that excitement might induce premature labor. After insistence and the sheriff's intervention, a brief examination was permitted. "Remarkable," Dr. Winters murmured as he completed his assessment. Turning to Martha, he asked, "When are you expected to deliver?" "Within 2 weeks," Martha replied. Mary's date was similar. Dr. Winters nodded grimly. "This woman will deliver within the same time frame. The positioning of the fetuses is identical to yours, Mrs. Sullivan. Even the pattern of fetal movement I detected matches what I observed in you earlier today. The statistical improbability is—" He trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought in mixed company. The confrontation escalated when Dr. Winters demanded to see the third floor. Dr. Pierce refused vehemently, claiming it housed patients with infectious conditions. The sheriff, increasingly troubled by the Institute's evasiveness and the strange atmosphere of abandonment, invoked his authority to search the premises. What they discovered on the third floor would haunt each witness for the remainder of their lives. The large open space had been converted into what could only be described as a laboratory. Twin examination tables dominated the center, fitted with restraints and connected to electrical apparatus of unfamiliar design. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with preserved specimens in cloudy liquid, developmental stages of what appeared to be identical twin fetuses, meticulously labeled with dates and case numbers. Most disturbing was a large journal open on the central desk, its pages filled with comparative photographs and detailed notes. The final entry, dated the day after Martha's escape, read, "Experiment culminating as predicted. Subject MS-1 successfully extracted and transferred to subject MS-2. Complete integration achieved. Memory transference at 92% completion. Upon delivery, the resulting triplets will represent the first successful case of artificially engineered identical multiples across separate maternal hosts. The implications for selective human development are profound." "My God," Dr. Winters whispered. "He's not just been experimenting on these women. He struggled to articulate the concept. Transferring aspects of one sister into the other. Combining them somehow." Martha collapsed into Sarah's arms, overcome by the implication. The woman they had just seen wasn't Mary pretending to be someone else. It was Mary with Martha's memories and characteristics being gradually integrated into her consciousness, a hybrid of both sisters being created through some incomprehensible medical violation. The sheriff ordered an immediate search for Dr. Blackwood, but the physician was nowhere to be found. Dr. Pierce, confronted with the evidence and facing arrest, broke down in a mixture of terror and relief. "It was never supposed to go this far," he sobbed. The initial research was theoretical, exploring the unique bond between identical twins. But when the Sullivan Sisters arrived, both carrying triplets, Blackwood became obsessed with what he called the ultimate experiment in developmental control. Pierce's testimony revealed the horrifying progression of Blackwood's work. It had begun with simple observations and comparative measurements, but rapidly advanced to active intervention. Using techniques developed through years of secretive experimentation, Blackwood had found ways to stimulate one sister while extracting biological material from the other, creating a one-way transfer of what he termed biological essence. He believed he could make Mary's triplets develop as perfect mirrors of Martha's, despite different fathers, Pierce explained. But then he discovered something even more sinister was possible. The transfer wasn't limited to physical development. Memories, mannerisms, even personality traits began crossing between them. The boundaries between the sisters started dissolving. As the implications sank in, Dr. Winters ordered Mary, or what remained of her, moved to Springfield General Hospital under guard. The sheriff organized a search party for Blackwood, who had reportedly departed that morning for Chicago with several trunks of research materials. And Martha, overwhelmed by the horror of what had been done to her sister and their unborn children, retreated into a protective silence, speaking only to Sarah. 3 days later, as the search for Blackwood continued without success, both women went into labor within hours of each other. Martha delivered first, 3 healthy boys, identical in every visible feature despite being fraternal triplets, according to her medical history. Mary's labor began 6 hours later, and under Dr. Winters' watchful supervision, she too delivered 3 male infants. The medical impossibility was immediately apparent. Mary's triplets were perfect mirrors of Martha's, not merely similar, but identical in weight, appearance, and even their distinctive birthmarks. One infant from each set bore an identical crescent-shaped mark on the left shoulder. Another pair shared a small dimple on the right earlobe. The third pair both had a unique whorl pattern in their hair at the crown. "This defies all natural law," Dr. Winters noted in his report. "Cousins born of different fathers cannot present as identical unless some unspeakable intervention has occurred." More disturbing were the behaviors observed in the following days. The infants, separated into different hospital wings, showed signs of distress when apart but calmed immediately when reunited, not just with their own brothers, but with their cousins. They moved in synchronized patterns, as if responding to the same internal rhythm. When one infant from Martha's set cried, his counterpart from Mary's set would begin crying seconds later, despite being rooms apart. Martha, recovering her strength and resolve, insisted on caring for all 6 children. "They're all mine now," she said simply. "Mary is gone. Whatever Blackwood did to her destroyed the sister I knew. These children are all that remain of our family." Mary's condition deteriorated rapidly after delivery. The artificial integration of Martha's characteristics began breaking down without Blackwood's ongoing treatments. She fluctuated between personalities, sometimes recognizing Martha as her sister, other times insisting she herself was Martha. Her speech patterns shifted mid-sentence, accents and vocabulary changing as if different minds were competing for control of the same body. "It's like watching someone torn between worlds," Sarah wrote in her final journal entry. "As if 2 souls were forced into a single vessel and are now tearing each other apart in their struggle to exist." On the 7th day after delivery, Mary Sullivan died. The official cause was recorded as complications from childbirth, but those who witnessed her final hours knew the truth was far more complex. Her last coherent words, spoken to Martha in their childhood dialect, were, "He made me into a copy, but a copy can't hold the original. Find him, Martha. Stop him before he tries again." The search for Dr. Blackwood intensified following Mary's death. Investigators tracked him to Chicago, where he had boarded a steamer bound for Europe. Communications with medical universities in Vienna, Edinburgh and Paris confirmed he had been corresponding with researchers interested in his work on multiple births, though the full nature of his experiments had been carefully obscured in academic language. The most disturbing discovery came 6 weeks later, when a trunk addressed to the Medical College of Paris was intercepted at the New York harbor. Inside, preserved in specialized containers, were tissue samples from both Sullivan Sisters and their infants, along with detailed journals documenting what Blackwood termed the successful transference of developmental patterns across separate maternal hosts. The journals revealed that the Sullivan case was not his first experiment, merely the first to succeed at the scale he desired. The horror that had unfolded in Oakmire might have become public knowledge had it not been for the intervention of several prominent medical institutions. Concerned about the damage to public trust in medical science, representatives from 3 medical colleges successfully petitioned to have the record sealed, the institute quietly demolished, and the events obscured beneath bureaucratic language and institutional silence. Martha Sullivan eventually relocated to Wisconsin with her sister's 3 children and her own, raising the 6 boys as brothers. Locals noted the uncanny similarities between the cousins, but attributed it to strong family resemblance. Only Martha knew the full truth, that the boys were the product of an experiment that had violated the most fundamental boundaries of nature and ethics, an experiment that had literally consumed her sister from within. Sarah Cooper never returned to nursing. Her journal, hidden among family papers for generations, provided the first thread that would eventually unravel the mystery decades later. She lived into her 80s, and neighbors often noted how she would watch children at play with a strange vigilance, as if looking for signs of something only she could recognize. The Oakmire Maternal Institute was dismantled by the end of 1844, its bricks repurposed for a church that local residents claimed was never free of a persistent chill, regardless of the season. The hill where it stood remained vacant for nearly a century, with locals claiming that nothing would grow on the soil where the institute had cast its shadow. Dr. Thaddeus Blackwood was never apprehended. Historical records suggest he established a new identity in Vienna, where a physician matching his description contributed to several papers on embryonic development throughout the 1850s. These papers, published under the name Dr. Thomas Blake, contained theories that paralleled Blackwood's work in Oakmire, though carefully stripped of their more controversial elements. The medical community embraced his contributions as groundbreaking while remaining ignorant of the human cost behind his knowledge. Reports from European medical circles described Dr. Blake as a solitary figure who rarely attended social functions and maintained a private laboratory where even colleagues were seldom invited. His particular interest in cases of identical twins and triplets was noted, though attributed to scientific curiosity rather than sinister intent. He died in 1867, reportedly from self-inflicted wounds after a laboratory fire destroyed decades of research. A final act that some later historians would interpret as conscience finally overcoming ambition. The Sullivan triplets grew into childhood under Martha's protective care. By their 5th birthday, the patterns that had been evident at birth became even more pronounced. The 6 boys, though raised as 2 sets of brothers, functioned more as a single unit. They developed language skills simultaneously, fell ill on the same days, and demonstrated identical intellectual aptitudes despite different schooling approaches. Most remarkably, they sometimes completed each other's sentences or reported identical dreams, phenomena Martha documented meticulously in private journals. They move through the world as echoes of each other, she wrote when the boys were 7. James will begin humming a tune in the morning, and by afternoon, Michael, who has been in a different town visiting his uncle, will return humming the exact same melody. They deny any communication between them, and I believe them. The connection transcends physical proximity. Blackwood created something that defies natural law, a resonance that cannot be broken even by distance. Martha's journals reveal her constant vigilance, watching for signs that the artificial synchronicity might fade as the boys matured. Instead, the connection only strengthened. When one boy broke his arm at age 9, his counterpart in the other set developed identical pain and swelling, despite no physical injury. Physicians attributed it to sympathetic response or hysterical manifestation, terms that Martha recognized as the medical establishment's way of categorizing what it couldn't explain. By their 12th birthday, the identical nature of the cousins had become impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Local physicians, fascinated by what they perceived as a natural phenomenon, began documenting the case. Martha allowed limited examinations but deliberately obscured the boys' origins, claiming all 6 were her natural sons from 2 separate marriages. The alternative, revealing Blackwood's experiment, risked subjecting the children to precisely the kind of scientific objectification she had fought to rescue them from. The boys themselves gradually became aware of their unusual connection. At 13, one set secretly conducted experiments to test the limits of their bond, documenting how sensations, emotions, and even thoughts seemed to transfer between them and their cousins. Their findings, hidden in a shared journal that Martha discovered years later, revealed both childish wonder and mature concern about their condition. "We are not entirely ourselves," wrote Thomas, the eldest of Martha's biological triplets. "Each of us contains echoes of another." When I close my eyes and reach into my mind, I sometimes find memories that don't belong to me. A different bedroom, a different mother's face. We have discussed this among ourselves and reached a troubling conclusion. We are incomplete as individuals. Whatever made us this way created 6 bodies, but fewer complete souls. As adolescence approached, the synchronicity began manifesting in more troubling ways. The boys developed identical personality traits regardless of their different experiences and environments. Martha noted with alarm how all 6 demonstrated the same specific interests, mannerisms, and even moral inclinations, despite her efforts to encourage individual development. More disturbing were the periods of dissociation, moments when a boy would become vacant and unresponsive, only to return to awareness with no memory of the episode. It's as if they time-share consciousness, Martha confided to Sarah Cooper in a letter dated 1857. One will suddenly adopt the personality of another, complete with memories and skills he shouldn't possess. Yesterday, William recited a poem that only Joseph had been taught, in Joseph's voice and mannerisms. When the episode passed, William had no recollection of doing so. I fear what Blackwood created was not just physically identical children, but a fragmented consciousness distributed across 6 bodies. The boy's 16th year brought the most alarming development. One morning in spring, Martha found all 6 seated at the breakfast table, their expressions identical, moving in perfect synchronization. When she spoke, they responded in unison, their voices blended in perfect harmony. The episode lasted nearly an hour before they suddenly blinked, looked around in confusion, and resumed their individual behaviors, with no memory of the event. These collective episodes increased in frequency over subsequent months. Local religious leaders, invited to witness the phenomenon, retreated in superstitious fear. The family physician, Dr. Reynolds, became convinced the boys suffered from a contagious form of hysteria and recommended separation. Only Martha understood the truth. The artificial boundaries Blackwood had created between the 6 connected minds were dissolving. What had been initiated as an experiment in physical development had evolved into something far more profound, 6 bodies gradually being inhabited by what was becoming a single, collective consciousness. By their 17th birthday, the situation had deteriorated significantly. The periods of collective consciousness now lasted days rather than hours. During these episodes, the boys spoke of themselves as a single entity, referring to I rather than we. They demonstrated abilities none of them individually possessed, playing musical instruments they'd never learned, speaking languages they'd never studied, solving mathematical problems beyond their education. "We are becoming whole," they explained to Martha during one such episode, all 6 mouths forming the words simultaneously. "The artificial divisions are healing. What was unnaturally separated at birth is finding its proper arrangement." Martha, desperate to understand and possibly reverse what was happening, finally broke her decades-long silence. She contacted Dr. Harold Winters, now elderly but still practicing in Chicago, and shared the complete history of the boy's origin and development. Winters arrived within the week, accompanied by 2 younger colleagues who specialized in neurological conditions. Their examination confirmed Martha's worst fears. The triplets weren't suffering from a psychological disorder. They were experiencing the final stage of Blackwood's experiment, a phase he had termed consciousness consolidation in his recovered journals, but had never witnessed firsthand. He created a biological and neurological connection that defied natural law. Dr. Winters explained gently. The identical development wasn't limited to physical characteristics. It extended to neural pathways, to the very foundation of consciousness itself. What we're witnessing is the inevitable resolution of an unstable system. 6 bodies cannot indefinitely maintain artificial boundaries between what was designed to function as a unified consciousness. The prognosis was devastating. The process of consolidation could not be reversed. Eventually, the 6 bodies would function permanently as a single entity, a consciousness distributed across multiple physical forms. The boys themselves, during periods of individual awareness, expressed both terror and strange acceptance of their fate. "Sometimes I feel more complete during the unified periods," Joseph confided to Martha, "as if I'm remembering parts of myself I didn't know were missing. It's frightening to lose control, but there's also a sense of rightness to it, like scattered pieces finding their proper arrangement." Martha made one final, desperate attempt to save her son's individual identities. Having traced Dr. Blackwood's path to Vienna through years of private investigation, she learned of his research under the name Thomas Blake. His final papers, published shortly before his death, hinted at a method for stabilizing artificially induced neural connections, a technique he had developed too late to implement in the Oakmire experiment. In the autumn of 1861, as the nation descended into civil war, Martha Sullivan departed for Europe with all 6 young men, now 17 years old. The journey was complicated by their condition. Periods of collective consciousness made public travel challenging, and the boys' occasional display of unusual abilities drew unwanted attention. They traveled as a family afflicted with a rare nervous disorder, a cover story that granted them privacy, if not comfort. Vienna's medical community initially welcomed them with scientific curiosity. Dr. Blake's former colleagues, now elderly but still active in research, recognized the significance of what they were witnessing. Tests confirmed what Martha had long suspected. The 6 young men shared identical brainwave patterns despite having separate physical bodies. During periods of collective consciousness, these patterns synchronized with perfect precision. Hope for a solution faded quickly. Blake's theoretical work on neural stabilization had never progressed beyond speculation. His laboratory notes, partially recovered from the fire that claimed his life, revealed that he had recognized the inevitable outcome of his experiment years earlier. His final journal entry, dated 3 days before his death, contained a single line: "What God has not joined together, man cannot keep asunder." The Sullivan boys spent their final months in a private sanatorium outside Vienna. The periods of individual consciousness grew shorter and less frequent. By winter, they maintained separation for only a few hours each day, typically in the early morning. Martha sat with them during these precious windows, desperately trying to connect with the individual sons she had raised and protected for nearly 2 decades. On a snowy morning in January 1862, the boys experienced their final separation. For 3 hours, each existed as himself: Thomas, William, James, Joseph, Michael, and Robert, speaking of their dreams, their memories, their hopes for what might have been. They thanked Martha for her protection and love, each in his own way, with his own voice and mannerisms. Then, as the winter sun reached its zenith, they fell silent simultaneously. When they spoke again, it was with a single voice emerging from 6 throats. "We are complete now," they said. "Not 6 incomplete fragments, but one whole being as we were meant to be before the intervention." The entity that now inhabited the 6 bodies demonstrated remarkable abilities. Multiple simultaneous tasks performed with perfect coordination, enhanced sensory perception, and an intelligence that quickly outpaced the most brilliant minds in Vienna's medical community. Yet it lacked the emotional connections that had defined the individual boys. It recognized Martha not as a mother, but as a caretaker of its physical vessels, regarding her with clinical appreciation rather than filial love. Martha remained with them for another year, watching as the being that had once been her sons and nephews evolved into something beyond human understanding. The medical community's initial excitement gave way to unease as they recognized the moral implications of what Blackwood had created. Not a medical breakthrough, but a fundamental violation of human autonomy and development. In spring of 1863, Martha returned to America alone. The 6 young men, now functioning as a single consciousness, remained in Europe under the observation of a specialized medical team. Reports of their condition continued to reach Martha through Dr. Winter's colleagues, each more disturbing than the last. The entity had developed abilities that defied conventional explanation: apparent telepathic communication with others, predictive capabilities that bordered on precognition, and an emotional detachment that made it increasingly difficult to maintain human connections. The final documented observation came in 1869, when the entity, now using the collective name the Unity, presented a series of mathematical and physical theories to the Vienna Academy of Sciences that were reportedly decades beyond contemporary understanding. Shortly thereafter, all 6 bodies disappeared from the sanitarium where they resided. Despite an extensive search, no trace was ever found. Martha Sullivan lived out her remaining years in quiet isolation on the Wisconsin frontier. She never spoke publicly about what had happened to her sister or the children they had carried. Her private journals, sealed with instructions that they remain unopened until 50 years after her death, contained the only complete account of the Oakmire experiment and its aftermath. When these journals were finally opened in 1923, most dismissed their contents as the elaborate fantasy of a troubled mind. Only a small group of medical historians recognized the correlation between Martha's account and certain anomalous records from the Illinois Medical Society archives. Their discreet investigation led to the discovery of additional evidence. Dr. Winter's case notes, fragments of Blackwood's journals recovered from Vienna, and most significantly, a collection of letters from European physicians documenting the unusual case of 6 physically distinct patients who functioned as a single consciousness. The case files were quickly sealed by mutual agreement of several medical institutions, concerned about the ethical implications for ongoing research in embryology and neurology. The Oakmire incident was deliberately obscured, reduced to vague references in specialized literature, and eventually forgotten by all but a handful of scholars. The true legacy of Blackwood's experiment remains unknown. Some speculate that the unity continued to exist in Europe under various identities, its distributed consciousness allowing it to operate in multiple locations simultaneously. Others believe the unnatural fusion eventually proved unsustainable, leading to the entity's quiet dissolution. A few fringe theories suggest it evolved beyond the need for human contact entirely, withdrawing from society to pursue its own incomprehensible purposes. Perhaps the most sobering aspect of the Oakmire case lies not in what happened, but in how easily it was concealed. The willingness of scientific institutions to protect their reputation at the expense of truth established a pattern that would be repeated throughout the coming centuries. In the name of progress, the most fundamental violations of human dignity could be buried in sealed archives and classified records. The small church built from the Oakmire Institute's repurposed bricks still stands today, though few who worship there know its materials once housed an atrocity committed in science's name. The Sullivan family grave in Wisconsin bears 6 empty plots alongside Martha's final resting place, spaces reserved for sons who never returned, whose fate remains one of medicine's darkest secrets. When science abandons conscience, progress becomes merely another word for power. And power without moral boundaries creates shadows that stretch across generations. The mystery of the Oakmire triplets reminds us that the most dangerous frontiers are not those of knowledge,